Today, we are going to study how to write an introduction. Introduction is the most important part of a paper that goes for publication, or of a thesis for a BA or an MA level, or even of a dissertation for a PhD level. There are specific ways in which this introduction should be written, and we will review them. The most important thing I want to encourage you to do is that right at the start, after you have the other documents that we already discussed, the abstract summarizing your contribution in a particular way that focuses it to a particular point, your table of contents or your skeleton, and you have some bullet points ready, you write introduction. Already as you're working on an abstract and the title and the skeleton, you can start to build, and you should start to build bullet points toward an introduction, and then you can write the introduction fast and you can write it right at the beginning. The reason I want you to do that is because this is going to set the tone for the rest of the assignment. I don't want you to postpone it too much. But it's very important to remember that the introduction can and should be changed later on. So you're making just a first draft that gets you ready to start the writing. I usually recommend to write assignments from beginning to the end. Even if you have a lot of ideas for chapter 3, don't jump there. Write first of all the introduction, and then ideally chapter 1 and chapter 2, and then you can get to chapter 3 when the time comes. So what we're going to do today is focus on how to write this introduction in the best possible way. My name is Shai Dotan. I am Associate Professor of International and Public Law at the University of Copenhagen Faculty of Law, and the purpose of this series of lectures is to help you improve your English and your research skills. When you're ready to start writing your introduction, the question is how to begin it. And let's start by what I really recommend that you will not do. I hate it when introductions have a series of quotes that are somehow connected to the rest of the paper or the thesis. I could see the logic behind it. Sometimes if we find a very nice quote that kind of throws out in a particular part of the work that we're doing, it can be useful, it can be interesting for the reader. My impression is that usually if you are a student and you're writing a thesis, chances are the professor is not going to appreciate that. Either the connection is going to be banal, in which case it's not very useful, or it's something very deep and interesting, and then in order to get it you need the kind of composure and attention that I don't think the examiner would actually dedicate. So I recommend that you don't do that. Often when I see that I get confused and I don't like it. The second thing that I recommend you don't do is make a definition of a word in the dictionary. I think this is really tasteless, and these theses that start with Oxford Dictionary defines a certain word. That's not necessary, that's not helpful, and I don't think that's very useful. Other than that, the sky is the limit. Your imagination can lead you in all kinds of different directions. But I think that the most important thing to remember is that the first paragraph or two of your introduction are your opportunity to impress the reader. Now, we already saw an abstract, usually, and a table of contents, so they know what the topic is about. So you don't have to be compelled to actually describe everything. What you can do is find something that gets their attention. I teach law, so for me, using a judgment or a story from a judgment is often an obvious choice. If you have a judgment with a great story, this is something you can definitely use. You can put it right there in the beginning, and that really draws the attention of the reader. It can be a story from the news, just the facts of the story, anything that shows how your thesis is valuable or useful. And remember, it has to be clear, it has to be easy to understand. If somebody has to read 3 paragraphs and they're completely in the dark, they don't see anything, that's not good. Even if the idea is very, very deep and interesting, you cannot demand too much from your readers. So start with an interesting story. That's the beginning. That can be 1 paragraph, it can be 2 or 3 paragraphs, let's say 1 page maximum, leading the reader into your idea by some kind of a story. If you don't find a proper story, That's also potentially fine. You can start with actually the meat of introduction, which can be composed in one out of 3 possible ways. The first option is the classical option, and that's the option I recommend to almost all of my students. In this option, what you have to do is basically write a long form summary of a thesis, which means that the same ideas that are discussed in abstract are to a large extent discussed in introduction. The structure can be different. The abstract, as you remember, starts from the broad and goes towards the more and more focus until it ends with a research question and hypothesis. The introduction does have to be written in exactly that way. You have already developed the idea, you have more place to write it. You can write for 3 or 4 or 5 pages, and in these pages you can easily describe the main arguments of your dissertation or your thesis or your paper. It's important that you are going to be clear. It's important that you're going to be concise. That's exactly the place where brevity is very important. Don't try to write too much. But it's not so important that you're going from this pyramid structure toward a very, very sharp end. It's perfectly fine to write in a structured, well-organized manner that covers the main points of your argument. After you've done that, I want you to add another paragraph. Just one paragraph, and not even a very long one. This paragraph we can call the roadmap paragraph, and in it you basically mention the contents of the next chapters at a level that is sometimes even shorter than the title. So chapter 1, that's so and so, chapter 2, so and so, chapter 3, examines so and so, and you can call these chapters or parts or sections depending on the genre in which you're working on, and sometimes you capitalize the word chapter, part, etc. Usually you put a period between, so obviously you capitalize them, and then each short sentence gives a very, very short summary of a chapter. It's not even a summary, because you can basically say what it does in a matter of a short sentence. So a lot of these sentences would be chapter 2 examines 5 words, chapter 3 examines 4 words, and that's it. And this way the reader that doesn't remember the table of contents, or doesn't read tables, he just reads the text, will see and will know exactly what to expect. And that's it. So that's the first classical structure. They get a full summary of the analysis, they know what to expect, and they get a very short overview of the other chapters. It's easy to write and it's easy to read, and that's why I recommend it to almost all students. Second option, you use the introduction to develop one in a series of ideas that basically build your analysis. If you're writing an argument, let's say a paper now for more advanced scholars, you want to put your emphasis on one particular point and address it right at the beginning. You can do that. I think it's easier to do if your thesis is more philosophical in nature. If you need empirical facts, then you cannot just pile them on in the introduction, it will be too long. But if you have one crucial argument that is philosophical or theoretical or even potentially doctrinal in nature, if you are looking at the legal doctrine, you can do it in the introduction and basically continue from there. Once you've finished writing this, again, put some kind of a roadmap for the rest of the chapters. It's a bit less elegant because now you didn't provide a summary of everything, and this is something that I usually recommend not to do. It's again more for advanced scholars writing a short paper where they have a very, very specific logical arguments. They can make a most important argument in the introduction and then add refinements or other arguments later on. For students, I strongly encourage you not to do that. By the way, in some journals that I publish in, the introduction is numbered, so it is part 1. In some, it is not numbered, so part 1 comes after the introduction. But that's just technicality. That's something that you need to be aware of. And again, some system would call these parts a part, a chapter, a section. These are all open for you, depending on what you see in the journal that you write on. Now we're going to the third and last possibility, which I've used in several of my papers, and that's a possibility in which you think that the chapters or the parts of your thesis or your paper are quite far apart and they don't fit nicely and easily into one clear argument. So what you want to do is you want to write in the introduction, after you describe for a paragraph or 2 or 3 something that is catchy and interesting for the reader, and maybe some kind of maybe a paragraph that explains what it is generally about, if they didn't read the abstract or they don't know it so well. Then what you want to do is you basically want to summarize all the parts that come later on. But this time you're not writing 5 words, you're writing a paragraph or 2. So basically you're writing a full summary of each of the parts later on. In most of my books, I use this method where my introductory chapter is basically a series of summaries of my latest chapters. I do that because this is a book. It's a monograph, and I've worked on it for many years, and it has many chapters that go in different directions and with different empirical evidence, different arguments, and I think it's useful for me to give a summary for each of the chapters separately. Now, if you're writing a short thesis, like a BA thesis, if you're writing a paper, this is something that you probably would not want to do. If you're writing a dissertation, this is something that you may want to do, because you're actually writing something that is even longer than a book, and you can basically write all the different chapters in order. And then obviously after you finish that, you don't need to write a roadmap in this first version. So to conclude, the first version of the classical conclusion, summary of everything in a roadmap, is the one recommended. The other 2 are usually for more advanced scholars in specific genres. So for the second version, maybe a very short paper with a very specific logical argument, and the third version for a whole monograph or dissertation where you actually need to write summaries of all the chapters one after the other. The question that you can ask now is, how long should the introduction be? And that's a difficult question to answer. If you're writing in the classical form as I recommended, so a summary of the thesis and a roadmap is just 1 paragraph, and the summary of the thesis could be anywhere between 2 and 5 pages, I would say. So you would have several paragraphs at the beginning, and then 2, 3, 4 pages maximum of a summary of the analysis of a paper, and then a roadmap that is just 1 paragraph. You don't want to write much longer than that. Again, think about the structure of a paper. So usually papers would be, if you have very short papers, 20 pages. If you have longer papers, 60 pages. Most of my papers are around 30 to 40 pages. And then I would write a very short introduction if I have a very quick summary of a quick point. And if it's a longer argument, it can get all the way to 5 pages. If you go to this summary of the different chapters, it can be longer. Again, probably closer to the 5 pages. I would probably not write more than that unless the paper itself is very long. Obviously, another part of that is the footnotes that can push papers around a bit, change the amount of pages. But usually I think if you have something very short and concise and good to say, don't be ashamed to write an introduction of 2 pages. It's perfectly fine. But if you don't have something that is really excellent, try to think about expanding the summary a little bit, and 5-page introduction is a good number. It gives the reader the main facts in a relatively short form. When you write a thesis, let's say a BA or an MA thesis, and that's usually a document that ranges from 40 pages to 80 pages, something like this, then again I think 5-6 pages is a good aim. You can summarize most of the thesis in this amount of pages, and you can do it in a way that is concise. If you see that you're getting the text is getting longer, then probably what you need to do is you need to cut part of it out. If you've written really good paragraphs that you think are worth keeping, great, put them in a different file, and maybe you can use them later for the chapter itself. But the introduction really needs to be very concise, so that's very important. The only unique situation that I face with introductions is dissertations, because dissertations is the introduction is a very strategic decision. For one thing, some schools send the first chapter of a dissertation to potential reviewers, and they decide based on that. And even if that's not the policy in your school, there's a good chance that potential reviewers would read only the first chapter of a dissertation. And that's why, as a supervisor, I really try to strategize the length of the first chapter of a dissertation. Is a dissertation where I know that people read the first 20 pages and they have no problem, they are going to say yes, we are going to review it, and then they're going to, pass the student? Or do I need to show that by the end of the introduction, all their initial doubts are disappeared and they're able to also be on board? So how much convincing do they need? Is the kind of student, topic, potential reviewers, level of writing, level of research, and so on, but 20 pages is enough for them to be convinced, or they don't even need that? They just, after read 2 or 3 pages, they know that they can be the reviewers? Or do I need to say more, and then I would just cramp things into the introduction, make it into kind of a mini dissertation? I would say, now that's it. That's something that you need to work with. But unless you're really writing a dissertation, and this is really a strategic decision, your main goal is to be brief. Don't overwrite in the introduction. Remember, you want to capture the attention of your readers. You want them to print out this paper and read it through. The introduction needs to be short. I recommended at the beginning of this video that you start writing the introduction. Don't hesitate, don't jump to other chapters, just write the most important part first. But this means that there's also a commitment involved. And this commitment is a commitment to change the introduction throughout the writing of a thesis as you get deeper into the research and you find new things. So this means that your introduction needs to be edited continuously. All the time as you're writing, you get new ideas, you see things are changing, go back and change the introduction. That's obviously especially true if your introduction is from the third and usually less recommended structure of summarizing all the next chapters. Then as you write them, go back and change. And even when I write the book after many years of research, and I told you that's usually the way I start with introductory chapter, summarizing the other chapters. Every time after I finish a chapter, I go back to my introduction and I change it very significantly, because even though I had thought about this chapter for years, when I wrote it, I saw that the situation is actually different and it needs to be changed. So change the introduction continuously. I would tell you that there are even experts who recommend that you view your introduction not as a real document, but just as a tentative draft. And you write it, keep it, but then write a new draft completely. So I think the most extreme version would be just put it to the side and write a new file from scratch. Now, I don't know if you have the time or the inclination to do that. If you do that, that's clearly a very good exercise. That's something that you can do. I don't always do that. Sometimes I am forced to do that. Papers sometimes need to be rechanged and shaped, and then I have to, several years later sometimes, write a new introduction. And that's always a good exercise. So if you are a beginner and you want to practice, or if you are an expert and that's a very important paper that you want to do the best possible job, call the introduction just a tentative document, put it aside and write it again in a new document after you've already written all the dissertation or thesis, or at least part of it. If you didn't do that, you edited it throughout, but you didn't write it from scratch at the end, what you have to do at the end is read it very, very carefully. I would even recommend that if you have a supervisor, send them the introduction again towards the end. Usually you will send them introduction at the beginning. Maybe you can send them introduction towards the end of the analysis. Maybe they don't want to read the full document before they get the final document from the secretary, but they will be able to read the introduction. Now they get a full picture of the thesis. You can have a meeting based on that. This will also prepare you for the defense if you have a defense. So my point is that the introduction, because it's so important and because it relates to all the parts of your analysis, needs to be reworked, both as you write it, view it as something very flexible, and as you write the thesis itself, and most importantly at the end, so that when you're submitting the introduction, would be the best possible document that you can, because the truth of the matter is it's probably going to be the most important part determining your grade. So when a person writes the introduction, they're going to have an opinion based on your thesis, and it's very difficult to change that. Even the other chapters are great, they already have this first impression. So if you want to get a good grade, you have to, of course, have also a good conclusion to the thesis, because that's the last thing they see. You usually have to have a good abstract and skeleton, because some examiners would read that thoroughly. But the most important part is the introduction. And that's why when I say begin early, start right at the start, do that. But remember, this creates an obligation to edit it very, very carefully. So at the end, the introduction is absolutely perfect.